One of the topics which comes up a lot on exam board questions is considering the impact of exchange rates on an economy. There are a number of ways in which exchange rates will actually feed through and have an effect on the macroeconomic indicators. And the idea in this video is just to go through the main ones so that you're in a position to, first of all, analyse these changes about how an exchange rate affects the macroeconomy, but then also evaluate some of those changes as well. And the example that we're going to look at here is a little bit topical at the moment, that the pound is appreciating against the euro. So the pound is getting stronger when compared to the Eurozone currency. So what we're going to do now is we're going to consider how this affects the various macroeconomic indicators. So we're going to have a look at how it affects the balance of payments on the current account. We're going to have a look at how it affects the rate of inflation in the UK. We're going to have a look at how it may well affect employment and the level of economic activity in the UK as well. So lots of chains of analysis that we're going to work our way through. First thing to consider is that if the pound appreciates against the euro, that means that each £1 buys more euro. That's a really important thing to think about. So if the pound is appreciating, that means that each pound buys more euro than it did before. And when we start to think about that, actually some of the implications start to become relatively clear. So let's think about this in terms of imports and exports. So if I consider what that means for my imports from Europe and my exports to Europe. What's going on with the imports? Well, now each pound buys more euros. So that means that anything that has a price in euros is now going to start to appear a little bit cheaper to me because each pound that I have will buy more of them. So what that means is that my imports from Europe will start to appear relatively cheaper because of the exchange rate. It's important when you explain this in an answer that you use the words relatively cheaper rather than they have become cheaper. It may seem like it basically means the same thing, but actually it's quite an important difference. And certainly when you move on to A2 and you consider the kind of effective exchange rates and internal devaluation as well, it's important to make that that difference quite clear. So imports from the euro area into the UK will appear relatively cheaper. Now, at the same time, if each pound buys more euro, then obviously the inverse must also be true. So each euro must buy fewer pounds. That's a simple statement of fact. That must be true. And therefore, if I am exporting my products from the UK into Europe, then each euro will buy fewer British goods. So what that means is that my exports from the UK appear relatively more expensive. And this really is the starting point for us. Once you've got this sorted out, then actually it starts to become a little bit more straightforward. You may well have come across the mnemonic SPICED to help you remember this relationship, which says strong pound, which is what we've got here, imports become relatively cheaper, exports become relatively dearer. And that can be a really good way of remembering these impacts of an exchange rate change on the relative value of imports and exports. So let's move on a little bit more then and start to consider how these things actually affect. So what we're going to carry forward here is that imports are becoming relatively cheaper and exports are becoming relatively more expensive. Now, one of the really common relationships that's asked about in exams, and indeed one that's very important as we move through economics in general, is the relationship between the exchange rate and inflationary pressure. Now, if you remember the previous slide, we basically said that if the pound gets stronger, then imports become relatively cheaper and exports become relatively more expensive. So we're going to carry on that line of analysis. Obviously, be aware that if the pound, or indeed whichever currency it is that you are talking about in your answer, has got weaker, then all of these arguments work in reverse. So you just have to flip them all around. So we've got two effects, remember, going on here. We've got imports becoming relatively cheaper because each pound buys more of them. And we've got exports becoming relatively more expensive because each foreign unit of currency buys fewer British goods than they did before. So let's think about how these work. We're going to start with the imports becoming relatively cheaper line of analysis. So if imports become relatively cheaper, we've got a couple of effects going on here. First of all, the more simple line, I suppose, is that we have an increase in demand for imports. If imports become relatively cheaper, as with any other product, we would expect that there will be an increase in the quantity demanded of imports. I'm going to leave that one and come back to it in a little bit. What this does mean, though, is that imported commodities and raw materials become cheaper. So think of this as kind of things like oil and so on, stuff like that. If the pound has become stronger, then each pound will buy more of those things. Now, these obviously will reduce costs of production. And we know that in macro, the costs of production are a key determinant of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So if I have a reduction in my costs of production, what that means is that I'm actually going to see my short-run aggregate supply curve shift to the right like this. And then if I put on my AD as well. So, and then real national output. And what we can see here from drawing these lines on is that we get our increase in GDP, increase in real national output, and we also see a reduction in our, let's leave those 1 and 2 over here, just to be consistent. So we get a reduction in our price level over here, and this is reduced cost push inflation. So if we think about kind of where this leads, then this over here, let's get the pen back. Then this means that coming down this side, we have a reduction in the cost push inflationary pressure, and as a result, we have reduced inflationary pressure overall. Now, if we come back and just think about where we were to start with, this is where we were to start with. So now let's have a look at the other side of the analysis, the exports becoming relatively more expensive. So let's see if I can get this up on the screen here. So exports relatively more expensive. So what effects is that going to have? Well, if exports become relatively more expensive, there's a reduction in export competitiveness. And as a result of a reduction in export competitiveness, we would get a reduction in quantity demanded of exports. It's likely that foreigners will buy fewer exported goods. Now, there's a reason I've left the increased demand for imports kind of from the previous line of analysis, because I'm now going to bring both of those together. So both of these two, as you can probably figure out, both of these two combined mean that that the balance of trade element of aggregate demand, the X minus M bit, that's going to get worse as a result of this. We're going to be exporting less, we're going to be importing more, so our balance of trade, and for the purposes of AS, you could also say it's likely that the balance of payments on the current account will get worse as a result of this. So what effect does this have then? Well, as we've said, the X minus M is a component of aggregate demand, and it's getting worse. So what that means is that we will also see, so we've got our short-run aggregate supply. We will assume that that doesn't move for the moment. And then we also have our aggregate demand and our new aggregate demand curve. And what we see here is that we get our reduction in the price level and our reduction in real national output. So just get our labels on here, so we're getting those marks as well. Must make sure that you put all of your axis labels on, otherwise your graph makes no sense at all. So you've got real national output. It also helps if you can read them. Real national output on your horizontal, that goes down. But again, the important thing as far as we're concerned in this question is what's going on here. Now, what we've got going on here is a reduction in inflationary pressure again. But because this is coming from a left shift of demand, of aggregate demand, this is demand pull inflationary pressure being reduced. And if we've got a reduction in our demand pull inflationary pressure, then that's also going to contribute to a reduction in inflationary pressure overall. So that's how we do the overall analysis chain there of the pound becoming stronger and how that works to reduce inflationary pressure. Now, as we've gone along there, we've seen various other elements of this as well. So you may well recall that that when we were talking about the balance of trade over here, we said that this also means that we will get a worsening of the balance of payments on the current account. We will also, the effect on the other elements will be uncertain, but if we go for the demand side effect being greater, then over here we can see that we get a reduction in real national output, and therefore we would expect perhaps an increase in unemployment as well, less derived demand for our exports, less derived demand for our labour because of less demand for our exports. And over here we see that that we would have an increase in real national output. So what are the effects of a strengthening pound on the economy? Well, we have reduced inflationary pressure, that much is relatively certain. We would also expect to see a worsening on the current account of balance of payments. We will see an uncertain effect on unemployment, and that's a great way to get evaluation in. It depends on whether the industries import their raw materials or not, or whether they export their final products or not. But that hopefully gives you a quick walk through the analysis of how exchange rate changes affect the economy. The next video is going to evaluate those analysis chains and see whether they will always hold.